The snow had been falling relentlessly for hours, shrouding our little town in a pristine, almost ethereal blanket of white. It was the kind of winter night that seemed to erase the world, silencing everything but the gentle hiss of snowflakes brushing against the window pane. I wrapped my hands around the warmth of my teacup and stared at the flickering flames in the fireplace. It was late, too late for my son Noah to be asleep. His episodes of sleepwalking always worried me, especially on nights like this when the world outside seemed both beautiful and treacherous. Across the room, Dan, my husband, snored softly on the couch, oblivious to the subtle creaks and groans of our old house. He had been working long hours lately, his exhaustion deep and palpable. I didn't have the heart to wake him, even as the familiar unease began to tighten in my chest. A soft thud from upstairs made my heart leap. I set down my mug and hurried to the stairs, my bare feet cold on the wooden floor. I tried to calm myself as I climbed. Noah's sleepwalking episodes were harmless, usually confined to wandering around his room or occasionally out into the hallway, but tonight something felt different. When I reached his room, the door was ajar, swaying slightly as if caught in a ghostly draught. The bed was empty, the duvet crumpled and lying on the floor. My pulse quickened. "Noah," I called softly and stepped inside. The moonlight streaming through the window illuminated the room, but there was no sign of him. Panic swept over me as I turned and glanced down the hall. The loft door, usually shut tight, was slightly ajar. My breath caught. Noah hated the attic. He had since he was a toddler. It was the one place he never ventured, not even during his sleepwalking episodes. But as I approached, I could hear the faint creak of the floorboards above, the unmistakable sound of someone moving about. "Noah," I called again, louder this time. I climbed the narrow stairs to the attic, the air growing colder with each step. The dim light bulb hanging from the ceiling flickered as I reached the top, casting eerie shadows across the cluttered room. There he was, standing in front of the frosted window, his small figure silhouetted against the pale glow of the moonlight. His hands were pressed to the glass, his breath fogging the surface. "Noah," I said quietly, moving closer. "What are you doing up here, love?" He didn't answer, didn't turn to look at me. His eyes were fixed on something outside, his blue pajamas blending into the icy light around him. My heart clenched as I reached out and placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. "What man, Noah?" I asked, forcing my voice to stay calm. "He's in the snow," he said, pointing out the window. "He says he's waiting for me." I followed his gaze, peering through the frosted glass. The moonlit yard stretched before us, silent and untouched, the snow unbroken except for the faint outline of trees swaying in the wind. "There's no one there," I said gently, pulling him into my arms. His little body was cold, shivering against mine. "It's just the snow, darling. Let's go back to bed." But even as I spoke, a strange shiver ran down my spine. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was out there, watching. I carried Noah back downstairs, holding him close as we passed Dan, who was still asleep on the couch. As I tucked Noah back into bed, I brushed his dark curls away from his face and kissed his forehead. "You're safe," I whispered. "I'm right here." The snow outside shrouded the world in a muffled stillness, the kind of stillness that only winter seems capable of creating. The fire crackled softly in the hearth, but even that sound seemed muted. I sat in the kitchen staring at the mug in my hands, the tea long since cold. My son Noah, now 18, had been sleepwalking again. It was something he hadn't done for years, and the resurgence of it worried me more than I wanted to admit. I wondered if the stress of his upcoming graduation and the uncertainty of his next steps were weighing on him more than he was letting on. Noah had always been one to keep things to himself. It wasn't that he was secretive, he just preferred to carry his burdens quietly. Over the years, I had learned to sense the undercurrent of his emotions, the unspoken tensions he couldn't put into words. Lately, I'd felt him growing closer to me in ways I hadn't expected. Our conversations, once brief exchanges about school or dinner plans, had become longer, deeper, and more personal. That night, after I'd found him standing in the hallway in the middle of his sleepwalking episode, I'd guided him back to bed. He didn't quite wake up, mumbling incoherently as I helped him under the covers. But as I sat at his bedside, his hand instinctively reached out and rested on mine, even as he slept. It was such a simple gesture, but it hit me harder than I could explain. I stayed there for a while, watching him. 18 years old, yet at that moment he looked so much like the little boy who used to curl up on the couch next to me, clutching his favorite blanket and asking me endless questions about the stars. Time had passed so quickly, stealing these moments before I had a chance to fully appreciate them. Lately, I had been acutely aware of the changes that were coming. In just a few months, Noah would graduate from high school and head off to college, or whatever path he chose. The thought filled me with equal parts pride and melancholy. He was growing into a thoughtful, capable young man, but the closeness we'd shared during his childhood was changing, or so I thought. In recent months, Noah had opened up to me in a way that felt like a return to something we'd lost. He'd linger in the kitchen after dinner, sharing details about his friends, his insecurities, even his fears. One night, as he helped me fold laundry, he admitted that he wasn't sure college was the right path for him. I don't know, Mum," he said in a low voice. "What if I choose the wrong thing? What if I mess everything up?" It wasn't easy to see him struggling, but it also felt like a privilege to be the one he trusted enough to confide in. I reassured him as best I could, reminding him that he didn't have to have it all figured out yet. "Life isn't a straight line, Noah," I told him. "It's okay to change your mind, to try things and realize they're not for you. You've got time." He had smiled then, a small, grateful smile that reminded me how much he still needed me, even as he learned to stand on his own. That night by the fire, after tucking him back into bed, I found myself reflecting on how our relationship had evolved. The closeness we shared now was different from the one we'd had when he was a child. Then I was his guide, his source of answers and comfort. Now it felt more like a partnership, a give, and there were times when I wasn't just teaching him, I was learning from him. There were times when the closeness felt almost overwhelming, like the night he sat beside me on the couch after a particularly difficult day. He hadn't said much, just rested his head on my shoulder and let out a heavy sigh. "I don't know how you do it," he murmured after a while. "You always seem to know what to say, even when it seems impossible." I had laughed softly, brushing his hair out of his eyes like I used to do when he was a boy. "It's because I've had years of practice," I teased, "and because I know you better than you know yourself." His eyes met mine, filled with a kind of gratitude that made my chest ache. "I don't know what I'd do without you, Mum. It wasn't always easy, this closeness. Sometimes it brought a weight of responsibility that was almost suffocating. I wanted to be everything he needed, his anchor, his safe place. But I also knew that part of being his mother was letting go. He needed to find his own way to navigate the world without leaning on me for every answer. And yet the thought of him leaving, of our quiet moments becoming fewer and farther between, was almost too much to bear. As I stared at the fire that night, the snow still falling outside, I made a promise to myself to cherish these moments, however fleeting, to hold on to the closeness we'd rebuilt, and to trust that even as he ventured out into the world, the bond we shared would remain. Because no matter how old he got, Noah would always be my son, and I would always be his mother, ready to catch him when he stumbled, to listen when he needed an ear, and to love him with a ferocity that no distance or time could diminish. It was a crisp January morning as Dan packed his bags for a week's business trip. He kissed my cheek with the same familiar warmth he always did, and gave Noah a firm pat on the shoulder before heading out the door. The sound of his car fading into the distance left the house unusually quiet. enveloped in the kind of silence that comes when a piece of the puzzle is temporarily removed. I tried to ignore the strange flutter of nerves as I stood in the kitchen, washing up from breakfast. Noah came in a few minutes later, his hair still disheveled from sleep, wearing his usual flannel pajamas and hoodie. At 18, he was several inches taller than me, his frame sturdy and confident, in a way that seemed to blossom almost overnight. "You okay, Mum?" he asked, his voice breaking the silence. He leaned against the counter, a slight smile playing on his lips. "Of course," I said, smiling back. "Just getting used to the quiet, I guess." He tilted his head, studying me for a moment before nodding. "It's strange without Dad here." His comment hung in the air longer than I expected, but I brushed it off. We spent the rest of the morning doing small chores around the house, sharing jokes and talking about everyday things. It felt easy, natural, something I valued in my relationship with him. As the week progressed, however, I began to notice subtle changes in Noah's behavior. He spent more time around me, finding reasons to linger in the kitchen while I cooked, or to join me in the living room when I settled down with a book. It wasn't unusual for him to seek my company, but there was something different about the way he looked at me now, an intensity in his gaze that felt unfamiliar. On the third night of Dan's absence, I decided to make a nice dinner. It wasn't much, a simple pasta dish and a bottle of wine I'd been saving for no special occasion. Noah came into the kitchen just as I was putting the food on the table. "Wow," he said, raising an eyebrow. "Fancy," I laughed, brushing a stray curl from my face. "Why not?" "Feels like we could both use something special." He grinned, grabbed the plates and carried them to the dining table. As we ate, our conversation shifted from casual banter to something deeper. He told me about his dreams of traveling, his fears of leaving home, and the uncertainty he felt about what lay ahead. "I just feel like everything is changing so fast," he admitted, twirling his fork in his pasta. "And I don't know if I'm ready for it." "You don't have to be ready," I said quietly. "Change will always feel overwhelming at first, but you're stronger than you think, Noah." He looked up at me then, his eyes holding mine in a way that made me catch my breath. "I think I get that from you," he said quietly. His words were simple, but there was something in his tone, something that made my pulse quicken. I laughed it off, tried to steer the conversation back to lighter topics, but the feeling lingered. After dinner, we moved to the couch and decided to watch a film. Noah sat closer to me than usual, his arm brushing against mine as we shared a bowl of popcorn. The warmth of his presence was comforting, but also strangely charged. Halfway through the film, I realized I wasn't watching the screen at all. My focus was on Noah. The way he looked at me out of the corner of his eye, the way his laugh seemed softer, more deliberate. When our hands met as we reached for the popcorn, he didn't pull away. Neither did I. The tension between us was subtle, unspoken, but impossible to ignore. I told myself it was nothing, that I was imagining things. He was my son, after all, and I was just over-analyzing the natural closeness that had developed between us in Dan's absence. But the following evening, as we sat around the dining table finishing dessert, Noah leaned back in his chair and asked a question that made my heart skip a beat. "Do you ever think about what life would have been like if things had been different?" he asked, his voice careful. I frowned slightly, not sure what he meant. "Different how?" He hesitated, his eyes searching mine. "I don't know, like if people didn't have to follow so many rules, if things could just be the way they felt right." His words sent a shiver down my spine, not because they were blatantly wrong, but because of the way they were delivered. I didn't know how to respond, so I said the first thing that came to mind. "I think rules are there for a reason," I said, keeping my tone light. "They keep us grounded." He nodded slowly, but his gaze didn't waver. "I suppose?" The conversation ended there, but the atmosphere didn't return to normal. That night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't stop thinking about the way he'd looked at me, the unspoken thoughts that seemed to hang between us. Over the next few days, we became even closer. He began to help me with everything: housework, errands, even cooking dinner. He'd sit beside me on the couch at night, his presence a constant reminder of the growing bond between us. It wasn't until Dan returned that I fully realized how much things had changed. Noah's behavior immediately changed, becoming more reserved, more distant. He avoided eye contact and spent less time in the house, retreating to his room or going out with friends. But when our paths crossed, his eyes still held the same intensity, the same unspoken question. It was a look I couldn't ignore, no matter how hard I tried. And deep down, I knew our relationship had crossed an invisible line, one I wasn't sure we could ever cross again. That night, the house was quiet, the snowfall outside thick and relentlessly, shrouding everything in a white silence. I curled up in bed and tried to lose myself in a book, but my thoughts kept drifting back to Noah. His sleepwalking episodes had been sporadic, but they had always made me uneasy. He hadn't walked around the house for a few nights, but the memory of finding him in strange places lingered. A soft knock on my bedroom door snapped me out of my thoughts. "Come in," I called, putting the book down. Noah stepped into the room, his hands tucked into the pockets of his jogging bottoms. His dark hair was unkempt and his expression was hesitant, almost vulnerable. "Hey, Mum," he said quietly. "Can I ask you something?" I nodded, gesturing for him to sit on the edge of the bed. He didn't, instead shifting his weight awkwardly. "I was wondering if you could, maybe stay in my room tonight." His request took me by surprise. "Why, darling? Is something wrong?" He looked away, rubbing his neck. "It's just the sleepwalking. I don't know, I keep thinking I'm going to wake up in the middle of the night and do something stupid. It would just make me feel better if you were here." There was something in his tone, an earnestness that tugged at my heart. He rarely asked for help, let alone something so intimate. I hesitated for a moment before nodding. "Of course, if it makes you feel safer." His shoulders relaxed and he gave me a small, grateful smile. "Thanks, Mum." A few minutes later, I followed him into his room. It was tidy as always, his bed neatly made, the soft glow of his bedside lamp casting a warm light over the room. He had already pulled back the covers on one side, leaving a spot for me. "This feels just like when you were little," I said with a laugh as I climbed in. "You used to come into my room when you were scared." He chuckled softly and lay down beside me. "Yes, I remember that. You'd always tell me a story until I fell asleep." I smiled and pulled the covers over me. "Do you want a story now?" I teased. "No," he said, his voice softer, more serious. "Just stay here." We lay there in the quiet warmth of the room, the low hum of the heater filling the silence. I closed my eyes, trying to relax, but something about the moment felt different, charged in a way I couldn't quite put my finger on. Noah's presence beside me was comforting yet unfamiliar. He seemed older, his once boyish energy replaced by the steady calm of young adulthood. "Mum," he said softly, his voice breaking the silence. I turned to him and met his gaze. His expression was serious, almost vulnerable, and it tugged at something deep inside me. "What is it?" He hesitated, running a hand through his disheveled hair. I've been thinking a lot about how much you mean to me, especially lately." My heart softened at his words. "Oh, darling," I said, reaching out to brush his hair from his forehead. "You mean everything to me too." "No, it's more than that," he said, his voice trembling slightly. "You've always been there for me, through everything, and with Dad gone on this trip, I guess I've felt closer to you." There was a sincerity in his words that touched me deeply. Over the past few days, I had noticed a change in him. The way he lingered in conversation, sought my company, and seemed to hold on to every moment we shared. But now, hearing him say it out loud, I realized how much he valued our connection. "You're my mum," he continued, his voice softer now, "but you're also my best friend. I don't know what I'd do without you." The seriousness in his tone filled me with a mixture of pride and tenderness. "Noah," I said gently, "you'll never have to find out. I'll always be here for you, no matter what." He nodded, his eyes fixed on mine. "No, I wanted to say it. I don't think I say it enough." I smiled, feeling a warmth spread through me. "You don't have to say it, Noah. I see it in everything you do." He leaned forward and kissed me on the cheek. For a moment, we just looked at each other, the space between us filled with a quiet understanding that only comes from years of shared experience. In that moment, I saw the depth of his gratitude, respect, and love for me as his mother. It was overwhelming in the best sense of the word. As he lay back, his head sinking into the pillow, I could see the tension in his expression melt away. "Thank you for staying tonight," he said softly, his eyes fluttering shut. "It really helps." "Anytime," I replied, my voice barely above a whisper. As he drifted off, I stayed by his side, watching the steady rise and fall of his chest. There was a peace in the room now, one that reminded me of when he was little, and I'd sit with him through storms or nightmares, reassuring him until he fell asleep. Only now he was grown up, his struggles more complex and his needs less straightforward. But my role remained the same: to be his anchor, his source of calm when the world felt uncertain. When I finally returned to my room that night, I couldn't shake the emotions his words had stirred in me. Our bond had always been strong, but this week had shown me how much it meant to him too. He was going through a difficult time, full of transitions and unknowns, and in his own way he was leaning on me as a source of stability. It was a role I was proud to play. Outside, the snow continued to fall, its quiet beauty mirroring the silence inside. As I lay in bed, I felt a renewed sense of purpose, an understanding that no matter how much Noah grew or how far he ventured, our connection would always remain a cornerstone of his life and mine.